The sea had turned black before the lamps were lit at Lennox's house. From the long windows of the west drawing room, it looked less like water than like some immense, living thing throwing itself against the rocks below the headland. Wind struck the glass in wet bursts. The ladies had been moved away from the windows twice already, and the gentlemen, having stood there long enough to pronounce the weather remarkable, had drifted back toward the fire and their glasses. Lady Margaret Tresham sat very straight on a blue silk sofa, one hand closed over her fan, as if a Highland storm were merely another inconvenience to be met with good posture. Fiona Lennox had abandoned her embroidery and gone once more to peer through the curtains. "If Jamie is still at the lower village," she said, "he will be drenched to the bone." Lennox, who disliked all mention of danger before dinner, answered, "Then he should have shown more sense." Alistair, Viscount Strathlevin, did not take his eyes from the window. A pulse of white water broke against the reef below and vanished. "He left before noon," he said. "He has had time enough to come round by the coach road." "Unless he took the shore path as he always does when he wishes to alarm us," said Fiona. Alistair was already turning away from the room. "I shall go down." His mother looked up sharply. "In this weather, you can do nothing from the beach except join him in folly. If he is not there, I shall know it within a quarter of an hour." The Earl, seated deep in his chair with a rug across his knees, grunted without opening his eyes. Let the boy go. Standing at a window never yet brought a man home. Lady Margaret's fan touched once against her wrist. "You are not going alone, I hope." "I shall take 2 men from the stable." Fiona moved at once. "I'm coming to the hall to see whether you bring Jamie back by the collar." That won from him the shadow of a smile, the first she had had all afternoon. "Stay by the fire, Fia." He was halfway to the door when a footman entered in haste, rein on his shoulders, though he had plainly crossed only the flagged court. "My lord, there is a boat below the headland. Tom Baird saw it from the yard. It took the outer rocks." Alistair stopped so suddenly that Fiona gave a little cry. "How many aboard?" The man swallowed. "Could not say, my lord. It was turning broadside in the dark." Alistair was out of the room before anyone could speak again. The wind hit him like a slap the moment the hall doors opened. By the time he had reached the lower path with 2 grooms behind him and old Tom Baird stumbling from rock to rock ahead, the rain had become a hard, needling spray that stung his face and turned the path to slime underfoot. Below, the sea boiled white around the black teeth of the reef. "There!" shouted Tom, pointing. At first Alistair saw only wreckage, one oar, the shine of a broken gunwale, something pale vanishing and appearing between waves. Then he saw a hand. He did not think. There was no time for thought. He threw off his coat as he ran, heard one of the grooms shout behind him, and plunged into water so cold it felt like iron striking the chest. The tide dragged at him at once, trying to wrench him sideways toward the rocks. He struck out against it, found nothing, lost the pale shape, found it again. It was not a hand, but a sleeve, the arm beneath it limp. He caught hold, went under, came up choking with salt, and locked his arm around a body far too still. The next wave drove them both toward the reef. He twisted, taking the blow of it on his shoulder, and for one sick instant thought the sea would tear her from him. Then Tom and one of the stablemen were waist-deep at the edge, shouting, reaching. "Here! My lord! This way!" He thrust her toward them first. They hauled her from his grasp across the stones, while he fought for footing and came stumbling after, half-blind, his chest afire. She lay on the shingle where the foam licked at her skirts and withdrew. Her bonnet was gone. Wet hair, darkened by the sea, clung across her face. "Back to the house," Alistair said, dropping to one knee. "At once." Tom crossed himself. "Is she living?" Alistair pressed shaking fingers below her jaw. For one terrible moment he felt nothing. Then, faint, thready, but there. Yes. He lifted her before the men could offer. She was lighter than she should have been, soaked through, one arm falling against him with the helplessness of a child. Her cheek, cold as the rain, struck the hollow of his throat. The climb to the house seemed endless. Servants had seen the lanterns by then. The great door flew open before they reached it, throwing warmth and gold across the stones. Voices rose in the hall. Mrs. Kerr appeared as if conjured. issuing orders before anyone else had breath. The Blue Chamber fire now. Blankets, hot bricks. Send for Dr. McLean. Miss Fiona, stand clear. Tom, get those wet things from the passage. Alistair carried the unconscious woman straight into the hall, water running from his boots across the black and white marble. Everyone had come out, his mother with a hand pressed to her breast, Fiona pale with alarm, Lady Margaret standing very still, the Earl supported in the doorway of the library, and cursing the weather as if it had personally insulted him. "Who is she?" Mrs. Lennox demanded. "From the boat," Alistair said. "She was alone when I found her." "Alone," repeated Lady Margaret quietly. The woman's head shifted against his arm as he turned toward the stairs. The lamplight fell full across her face. A strand of wet hair slid back from her brow. He saw a mouth he had once watched quiver with suppressed anger in a drawing room in Bath. He saw the dark lashes against cheeks gone white with cold. He saw, unmistakably, the fine straight line of her nose, the proud shape of her chin. For a second the whole tilted under him more sharply than the sea had done. Not dead then, not married and lost beyond memory, not safely vanished into a life from which he could excuse his own part by distance and time. Miss Eleanor Vale, Fiona, nearest the stair, looked from the woman's face to his and went still. She had been 16 that summer, old enough to remember. "My God," Alistair said, and heard in his own voice that he had spoken her name without sound. Eleanor's eyelids flickered. A breath shuddered through her. Her lips parted with the effort of waking, and though her eyes did not fully open, she turned faintly away from him as if even half-consciousness knew him. Mrs. Kerr stared once, hard, and understood more than she said. "The Blue Chamber, my lord," she repeated in a lower tone, "before the poor lady freezes." Alistair tightened his hold and mounted the stairs with Eleanor in his arms, every gaze in the hall following him, and knew before he had reached the landing that the storm had carried more into Lennox House than a half-drowned woman. It had brought back the one name that had no business beneath his roof, and there would be no hiding that he knew it. By morning the storm had settled into a heavy rain that blurred the world beyond the windows and laid a grey hush over the house. Eleanor had been awake since dawn. Whenever she drifted, the sea returned. The sick lurch of the hired boat, a shouted warning, the crack against hidden rock, black water closing over her head. Then only cold violence and afterward heat, lamplight and a heartbeat under her cheek that was not her own. She had known, even before memory steadied, where she was. Lennox House had not altered enough to deceive her. The Blue Chamber still held the rosewood screen by the hearth, the faded pastoral over the mantel. The bell-pull worked with little gold acorns. The sight of it had turned her stomach more than the storm. Mrs. Kerr had come and gone with broth, dry linen, and the brisk mercy of a sensible woman. Dr. McLean had peered, prescribed rest and forbidden travel until at least the following day. Lady Beatrice Marchmont, whose maid had finally been traced to a posting inn 3 miles away, had sent a note full of outraged affection and promised to come as soon as the roads permitted. And beneath all this kindness lay one fact. She was under Alistair Lennox's roof. She stood now beside the bed in a dark wool gown lent by Fiona Lennox, her own clothes still drying before the laundry fire. Her hair had been brushed and coiled as plainly as possible. Color had not returned to her face, but composure had. She would need it. A tray had been laid in the little sitting room. Tea, toast, soft eggs, marmalade. Fiona herself had brought it an hour earlier, all warmth and bright concern, though uncertainty flickered underneath. Fiona remembered. Of course she remembered. The knock came just as Eleanor set down her untouched cup. "Come." It was not Alistair. It was his mother. Mrs. Lennox entered with the smooth dignity of a woman accustomed to every threshold yielding to her. She wore pearl grey silk and a lace cap soft enough to suggest gentleness, though her face did not. "Miss Vale," Eleanor curtsied. "Miss Lennox." The older woman's glance travelled over the room, the tray, the fire, the shawl over the chair, as if confirming the household had not been negligent. "I trust you find yourself recovered." "Much improved, thank you. This has been an unfortunate business. I regret the trouble caused to your house," Eleanor said. Lennox's mouth altered by scarcely a line. Since circumstances have made you our guest for the moment, I thought it proper to call. There had never been any warmth between them. Mrs. Lennox had been civil when Eleanor's father was alive, and her prospects still respectable. After Bath, she had not called at all. I am obliged by your civility. Lady Beatrice speaks highly of you. Her ladyship is very generous. Mrs. Lennox moved nearer the window. There are several people in the house, as you saw last night. The weather-detained neighbors expected only for dinner. My son has friends under his roof. Lady Margaret Tresham is among us. The name was laid delicately between them. Eleanor did not lower her eyes. So Miss Fiona told me. It is not my habit to make difficulties where none need exist, Mrs. Lennox said. I am sure you have no wish to invite remark. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, but her voice stayed calm. No woman with my history would seek it. Lennox looked at her directly, perhaps surprised by the frankness. I'm glad we understand one another. A second knock came before Eleanor could answer. Fiona entered with determined brightness, and behind her stood Lady Margaret Tresham in dove-colored morning silk, every inch composed. I hope we do not intrude, Lady Margaret said. Miss Lennox insisted that if we are to be weather prisoners together, we must at least behave as though civilized. Fiona gave Eleanor an apologetic glance. I thought you might welcome company, but if you are tired. No, said Eleanor. To retreat now would be to confess too much. Pray come in. Mrs. Lennox stepped aside with a smoothness that suggested she had expected this and did not mind looking considerate for allowing it. Lady Margaret crossed to the fire. She was beautiful in the finished way certain women were beautiful. Not soft, but exact. Her fair hair had not dared to fall from its place. Her expression held not hostility, but the cool alertness of a person who had found herself in the opening scene of someone else's drama. Lord Strathleven tells us you were traveling with Lady Beatrice, she said. I was. How alarming for you. Yes. Fiona, poor girl, could bear such conversation no more than a cat could bear rain. She took up the teapot. Miss Vale, you must have some tea. Mamma, will you sit? Lady Margaret, if you please. Tea was poured. Conventional questions followed her health, the weather, whether the doctor had been hopeful. Eleanor answered all with composure. She did not miss that Mrs. Lennox watched her as one might watch a candle near expensive curtains. Then the door opened once more, and Alistair came in. He halted when he saw the room full. He had changed from the wet clothes of the previous night and looked again exactly what the world believed him to be. A man built for command, grave and self-possessed. Dark hair, still damp at the temples. Broad shoulders filling the doorway. Only his eyes betrayed him. They came first to Eleanor, and she saw again the shock that had crossed his face in the hall. Forgive me, he said. I did not know. That your guest would receive callers, said Lady Margaret lightly. A faint color touched his cheek. Miss Vale, I hope to inquire after your strength. Eleanor set down her cup before her hand could betray its tremor. You see me improved, my lord. I am glad. Silence pressed in. Fiona looked from one to the other with strain at the corners of her mouth. Mrs. Lennox's fingers folded over her teacup. Lady Margaret let her fan rest unopened on her lap and said nothing at all. Alistair took one step farther into the room. If you will allow it, Miss Vale, I should like a moment to express— He stopped. Eleanor spared him the labor. You have already done enough, Lord Strathleven. The words were perfectly courteous. It was the room that changed them. Fiona's hand froze on the teapot. Mrs. Lennox looked down. Lady Margaret's eyes sharpened. And Alistair, who had once wounded her before a brighter company than this, stood utterly still. Eleanor met his gaze and gave him the smallest inclination of her head. I mean, of course, that you saved my life. For that I must thank you. But I would not have you trouble yourself further on my account. I should be sorry to disturb the arrangements of your house more than I already have. It was impossible to mistake her meaning. Not after Bath, not with Lady Margaret seated 10 feet away. A man less disciplined than Alistair might have flinched. He did not, but all the warmth had gone from his face. Miss Vale, he said quietly, your safety can never be a disturbance. Lady Margaret's fan touched once against her wrist. Mrs. Lennox rose at once, silk whispering around her. I think Miss Vale must be fatigued. Fiona stood too quickly, nearly upsetting the cream jug, and Lady Margaret set down her untasted tea with immaculate calm. Alistair moved aside to let them pass, yet his eyes did not leave Eleanor's face. By the time the door closed behind the last of them, one thing had become plain as the rain against the windows. Whatever had once been hidden under politeness could not be hidden now. He had not merely rescued a half-drowned stranger. Before his mother, his expected bride, and his own sister, he had been denied the comfort of easy gratitude. The rain eased toward noon, though the sky remained low and silver, and the sea beyond the headland rolled like lead. Eleanor endured one more hour in the blue chamber, and another half under Fiona's anxious kindness, before deciding that, if she stayed much longer among borrowed cushions and invalid trays, she would begin to feel as helpless as everyone wished her to be. Mrs. Kerr, after one measuring look at her color, allowed her downstairs on condition that she sit by the fire and attempt no heroics. Eleanor promised obedience with such gravity that the housekeeper's mouth twitched. The morning room on the west side of the house had always been her favorite room at Lennox House, though she would once rather have bitten out her tongue than admit it. It was smaller than the state drawing room, lined with books at one end and windows at the other, and in winter there was nearly always a fire. Lady Beatrice, delayed still by the roads, had once sat there playing piquet with the late Countess. Fiona had hidden novels behind the blue sofa. Alistair had stood at the mantel one August evening and laughed at something Eleanor herself had said. That memory was sharp enough to wound. She sat now in a straight-back chair near the hearth with a volume open and unread upon her lap. Rain ticked faintly against the panes. The room smelled of cedar, coal, and damp wool drying somewhere out of sight. The door opened. She knew without looking who it was. Some people entered a room by permission, some by stealth. Alistair entered as if the house acknowledged him before the door did. "I was told you had come downstairs," he said. Eleanor kept one finger between the pages and lifted her eyes. "Then you were accurately informed." He closed the door behind him, firmly enough to say he had come for a purpose. He wore a dark coat, plain linen, no ornament but the signet ring on his hand. He looked tired in a way rank did not often permit men to look. "If I am unwelcome, I will go." "You are unwelcome," she said. "Whether you go is another matter." A flicker, almost a wince, crossed his face. He came no nearer than the other side of the hearth. "I deserved that." "Yes." The fire shifted. From somewhere in the passage came the muffled sound of a tray being carried away. He said, "Miss Vale." "Eleanor," she interrupted, "if we are to speak of what you deserved, at least do not hide behind ceremony." His gaze sharpened. "Very well, Eleanor." It had been too long since she had heard her name in his voice that it still moved something in her was intolerable. "You wish to express yourself this morning," she said. "You may do so now, if you can bear plain answers. I did not come to ask kindness." He rested one hand on the mantel, then let it fall. "What passed in your room made it clear that gratitude for the rescue is the smallest part of this. I have lived too long with a version of the past that favored my own conscience." Eleanor gave a short, mirthless breath. That must have been uncomfortable. He accepted the blow. "Tell me what I did to you." The sheer arrogance of it nearly made her laugh aloud. "Tell me." As if the account existed for his inspection, to be entered and balanced. But she closed the book on her lap and told him. "You had better remember Bath," she said. "I should hate to think only one of us carries it." He did not move. "Your brother had spent the better part of 2 weeks making himself agreeable to me. I was young enough to think it might mean something, and poor enough to know it must not. I avoided him when I could. I did not encourage him. When he followed me into Lady Wexford's conservatory on the night of her musicale and began talking nonsense of admiration, I told him to leave me in peace." Alistair's jaw set. "You came upon us before he obeyed. You saw him flushed and foolish, and me angry. You asked no questions worth the name. You did not ask whether I had invited him. You did not ask whether I wanted his attention. You decided." I still hear the exact words. Her fingers tightened over the book. She looked at the fire. "You said, before Lady Wexford." Before Mrs. Charrington, before half the room within hearing, that your family would not be hunted by every portionless girl with a pretty face and a clergyman for a father. The room became very still. He had gone white under his tan. "You remember now," she said softly. He said nothing. "It was not only that one insult. People repeated what you said because you had said it. Hostesses who had been glad enough of my singing and my company suddenly found their lists full. Invitations ceased. One woman, kinder than the rest, warned me that my name had become inconvenient. My father had just died. My brother's small living barely maintained his own family. I went to relations who did not want me, then to paid companionship because there was nowhere else to go without becoming a burden." She looked at him then. "You did not strike me in anger and repent the next hour. You altered the weather around me. Everywhere I went after that, something had cooled." For the first time since entering the room, Alistair lowered his head. "I thought Jamie." He stopped as if the excuse sickened him before it left his mouth. "You thought a man of your blood had only to smile, and I would set a cap at him. Say it properly." His eyes lifted to hers, stripped now of defense. "Yes," he said. "I thought the worst because it cost me nothing to think it." The honesty of it landed harder than denial would have done. Eleanor felt her throat tighten and hated that it should. He went on, voice rougher than before. "I told myself I was protecting my brother from a foolish entanglement. In truth, I was protecting my own pride and perhaps my family's comfort. I did not ask whether you were innocent because I had already placed you where innocence would not matter." "Exactly." He crossed then, not close enough to touch her, only near enough that she could see the dark rim of weariness under his eyes. "What can I do?" The question burst from him like pain. For one wild instant she wanted to say nothing, to let him stand in the emptiness he had made. But she had not survived years of dependence by refusing practical truths. "You can begin," she said, "by understanding that apologies offered in private are a luxury for the person who gives them. You shamed me before people. You let me be judged by your certainty. If you seek ease for your conscience, while the world goes on believing you were right, then you have learned nothing." He stared at her. At length he said very quietly, "Then I have not yet begun at all." "No." Her voice softened despite herself. "You have saved my life, Lord Strathleven. It was a brave thing, but courage in rough water is not the same as courage in a drawing room." A flush rose slowly in his face, not of anger but of shame accepted at last. He stepped back. "Thank you for speaking plainly. I did not do it for your comfort. I know." He reached for the door, then paused. "There is to be a dinner tonight. Some neighbors remain from the storm, and others may still come if the road from Invercraig clears by evening. My mother would wish me to say that you are not expected to appear." Eleanor understood the courtesy for what it was: concealment, protection perhaps, and danger all at once. "And you?" she asked. He met her gaze. "I have no right to wish anything of you." That, at least, was true. When he had gone, the room felt altered, as if some hidden shutter had been thrown open and let in colder air. He knew now what his words had cost, and if she went downstairs that evening, he would have to decide whether he meant to answer for them. By 7 o'clock, the candles were lit in every branch and sconce of the dining room, and the storm of the previous night had become, in proper company, a subject fit for anecdote. The table shone with silver and crystal. Rain still whispered against the windows, but the long room glowed with candlelight, polished mahogany, and the reassuring order of dinner laid exactly as dinner ought to be laid. If one ignored the sea and memory and the fact that a woman once dismissed from such tables had been seated again at one of them, the evening might almost have seemed ordinary. Eleanor had been placed midway down the table on Mrs. Lennox's right, a position neither intimate nor hidden. She suspected the arrangement had cost some thought. Lady Margaret sat on Alistair's other side near the head, serene in deep green silk. The Earl presided with an air of having endured both weather and guests for many years, and found neither especially novel. Fiona was bright with nervous effort. Jamie had returned at last from the village before dressing for dinner, and now looked handsome, restless, and too careful in his gaiety. Across from Eleanor sat Mrs. Charrington of Edinburgh, a widow with bright eyes, excellent lace, and the kind of memory that sharpened itself on other people's history. So far the first course had passed in safety. Alistair, from the head of the table, had not once addressed Eleanor directly, but she felt his attention as distinctly as the warmth of the candles. Each time a servant approached her chair, he looked up. When Jamie laughed too loudly, Alistair's expression cooled. It might have moved her if she had been willing to be moved by vigilance after the fact. Mrs. Charrington accepted a glass of claret and turned her head slightly toward Eleanor. "I think," she said in her clear Edinburgh voice, "that last night's storm will be talked of all the way to Invercraig. Such a dramatic rescue. One does not expect romance from the sea at this time of year." Fiona nearly dropped her fork. Lady Margaret lowered her eyes to her plate. Jamie took too large a swallow of wine. And Mrs. Lennox's smile fixed itself with the determination of a pinned ribbon. Eleanor answered pleasantly, "Then I hope the sea may be denied the credit, for I found it a rough companion." A small laugh moved along the table. Mrs. Charrington inclined her head. "Very neat. I had not realized until this morning that we had met before. Your face struck me all at once. Lady Wexford's musicale in Bath, was it not? Though perhaps I mistake the place." There it was. Not the full blow, only the first delicate touch of the knife. Eleanor laid down her fork. "You do not mistake, ma'am. How strange the world is." Mrs. Charrington smiled into her wine. "One loses sight of people and then finds them again in the north and under such singular circumstances." Across the table, Jamie had gone pale. Fiona stared fixedly at her plate. The Earl, who missed little when food was at stake, glanced from one face to another with growing irritation. Lady Margaret remained motionless, but the hand holding her stemmed glass had tightened. Mrs. Lennox said smoothly, "Miss Vale now travels with Lady Beatrice Marchmont." Indeed. Mrs. Charrington's brows rose. How very fortunate for Miss Vale. Lady Beatrice has always had the kindest impulses where deserving females are concerned. Eleanor could almost hear the room become alert. She lifted her water glass and set it down again with care. "Her ladyship has been kindness itself." "I'm delighted to hear it." Mrs. Charrington smiled, as if they shared some feminine understanding. "There was, if I remember, a silly flutter of gossip at Bath, about a young gentleman and a conservatory. But one ought never to trust watering-place stories. They bloom and fade in a week." Mrs. Lennox's fork touched porcelain with a distinct click. Jamie looked as if he wished the floor would open. Fiona's cheeks had gone crimson. Alistair, at the head of the table, had gone very still. Eleanor felt that stillness before she looked up. Mrs. Charrington was still smiling. She had not spoken loudly. She did not need to. The servants moved around the walls with lowered eyes, hearing every word and pretending to hear none. "It faded more slowly than a week," Eleanor said. That checked the widow for the briefest instant. "My dear Miss Vale, I did not mean—" "No," Eleanor said, and her voice remained even. "But you remembered it clearly enough." Fiona's gaze flew to hers in startled gratitude. Somewhere near the lower end of the table, a gentleman coughed into his napkin. Mrs. Charrington colored faintly, then rallied. "I hope you do not suppose me unfeeling. I merely meant that society is absurdly fond of embroidery." "On that point," said Alistair at last, "society generally requires a first thread." Every face turned toward him. He had not raised his voice. He sat with one hand resting beside his wineglass, his expression composed enough to satisfy any stranger. Only Eleanor, who had once watched anger and pride war behind that restraint, saw how hard the control was held. Mrs. Charrington gave a nervous little laugh. "Very true, Lord Strathlyven, though in my experience no one can ever discover who held the needle first." This was the moment. Eleanor knew it as surely as if the room had rung a bell. The air itself seemed to wait. One sentence from him, one plain sentence, and the whole shape of the evening would change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. He need only say that Miss Vale had been wronged. He need only say he had wronged her. Instead, after one terrible pause, Alistair said, "Then perhaps we should be wise enough not to admire the pattern. It was deft, it was polished, it was utterly insufficient." Mrs. Charrington, relieved, spread her hands. "Exactly so. I am rebuked." Conversation, uncertain but grateful, stirred elsewhere. The Earl asked for the pheasant. A gentleman on Fiona's left began discussing the washed-out bridge to Perthshire. The room moved on because rooms like this always moved on, and because no one with power had required them to stop. Eleanor sat very straight and felt the old chill move through her with such cruel familiarity that for a moment she could hardly breathe. Not the same words this time, not the same violence. Something worse in its own way. He had seen the wound open and chosen civility over truth. A servant came with the next dish. She did not trust herself to touch her glass. Across the table, Jamie looked at her in naked misery. She spared him nothing. Then her eyes lifted to Alistair. He met her gaze at once. Perhaps he had felt it before he saw it. There was remorse in his face. Shock, too, as if he already knew what he had done by not doing enough. But he had done it all the same. Eleanor gave him the smallest, calmest inclination of her head. A social acknowledgement no one else at table could have found remarkable. Only he saw the dismissal in it. When the ladies rose at last and the rustle of silk began around the table, Fiona reached instinctively for Eleanor's hand under cover of her skirts and pressed it once. Eleanor returned the pressure, because the girl was innocent of this and ashamed for him. Then she withdrew her fingers and walked from the room with the other women, leaving behind one undeniable change. Alistair had been tested before witnesses, and he had failed her. The next afternoon broke bright and treacherous. After 2 days of rain, the sky had opened into a pale blue strewn with high white cloud, and the sea, which had raged like a beast, now flashed almost prettily beyond the cliffs. The house, relieved of weather and dinner party tension for a few hours, breathed easier. The neighboring guests had not yet departed, but the pressure of company had loosened. Doors stood open to the terrace. A groom led horses through the yard. Somewhere below stairs, someone laughed. Eleanor had spent the morning with Lady Beatrice at last, for the dowager had arrived in a carriage spattered with mud and indignation, and kissed Eleanor's forehead as if she had returned from the dead solely to inconvenience everyone who had worried. She now reposed upstairs with broth, shawls, and a running commentary on the deficiencies of Scottish roads. Her presence steadied Eleanor more than she would have admitted. It was Fiona who begged for air. "Only to the Beacon steps and back," she said in the hall, fastening her bonnet with impatient fingers. "If I stay indoors another hour, I shall become as stale as the biscuits in the saloon." Mrs. Lennox objected on principle. Lady Beatrice, from her chair, observed that girls denied a walk always found a way to turn melancholy in the most theatrical manner. Alistair, standing by the window with a letter in his hand, looked at the sky and said the wind had dropped enough if they kept to the upper path. Eleanor might have refused. She ought perhaps to have refused. But the morning had pressed too many walls around her, and Fiona's eyes held such hopeful entreaty that she relented. The path wound along the western side of the house, across cropped grass still silvered with damp, then narrowed as it climbed toward the old stone beacon. The cliffs fell steeply to the sea below. Gulls wheeled and cried. Fiona walked a little ahead, lifting her skirts, her curls escaping almost at once from beneath her bonnet. "I know what you are doing," Eleanor said. Fiona glanced back with false innocence. "Taking exercise? Trying to make me forgive your brother through scenery." That brought color to the girl's face. "I do not think scenery equal to the task, but I thought air might be kinder than drawing rooms." Eleanor's mouth softened despite herself. "You are very transparent, Lady Fiona. Then it is fortunate I have never aspired to be a diplomat." She slowed until they walked side by side. "I'm sorry for last night. You need not be. I do, though." Fiona tugged off one glove finger and pushed back a curl with exasperation. He ought to have said more. Eleanor looked ahead. Yes. Fiona was silent long enough to show she understood the weight of that little word. Then, with youthful courage, she said, "He has never looked as he looked after dinner. Regret suits many gentlemen. It costs them very little. I did not say regret. Fiona's tone had sharpened. I said he looked wretched. Eleanor had no answer ready to that, which annoyed her. They reached the old beacon, a squat stone tower no longer used except by boys, gulls, and romantically minded visitors. Beyond it, steps cut into the rock zigzagged down toward a lower shelf above the sea. The Lennox children had once been forbidden to descend them and had therefore descended them constantly. Fiona moved toward the edge with the confidence of memory. The view is finer from the second landing. Do not, Eleanor said at once. Fiona laughed over her shoulder. I am not 12. At that same instant, a shrill cry rose from below. Both women turned. On the lower landing, perhaps 20 feet down, a small boy in a rough jacket stood flattened against the rock, one hand clinging to a weed-slick rail. A dropped basket had rolled past him and lay broken on the stones. He could not have been more than 8. Tommy Kerr? Fiona gasped. The child looked up, white with terror. My lady, I canna get up. The step below him gave way in a scatter of gravel and went skittering toward the surf. Fiona uttered a frightened sound and would have rushed down at once. Eleanor caught her arm. Stay where you are. If you slip, you will send us both after him. But he will fall. Then be quiet and do as I say. The command startled obedience into her. Eleanor was already moving. She knew these steps. She had been reckless on them once herself. She tested the first stone with her foot, then the next, one gloved hand against the wall, skirts gathered hard against her knees. Tommy, she called, keeping her voice level, though the drop below showed too much sea. Look at me, not the water. His lip trembled violently. I only wanted gull's eggs. Yes, and I dare say your mother will have much to say on the subject later. Just now you will put your left foot where I tell you. Above, Fiona had found her own usefulness. I'm taking off my sash, she said breathlessly. Will that help? It may. Eleanor descended 2 more steps and stretched out her hand. Tommy, now. He made a blind little movement toward her and slid. Eleanor dropped to one knee on wet stone and caught him by the arm so sharply that pain must have shot through both of them. His frightened weight jerked her sideways. For one sick moment, all she saw was sky and sea. Then the child collided against her, sobbing, and she dragged him upward to the landing. Fiona was already kneeling above with the sash twisted into a rope. Between them, they got him up the last steps in a scramble of tears, scraped palms, and ruined dignity. By the time Eleanor reached the top, breathless and mud-streaked, Alistair was striding across the grass toward them at a speed that made 2 startled spaniels leap aside. Jamie and one of the stablemen followed close behind. What happened? His voice was sharper than the wind. Tommy flung himself at the stableman, crying in great hiccuping gasps. Fiona, kneeling on the path with her bonnet half off and cheeks blazing, pointed at Eleanor. She went down for him. Alistair's face changed so swiftly that for a moment it was almost bare. Not only fear, pride, shock, and something warmer and more dangerous. He looked from the broken steps to Eleanor's scraped hand, still reddening where the stone had torn her glove. You might have been killed, he said. Eleanor straightened. So might the child. Jaunt Mrs. Kerr came hurrying from the house then, shawl flapping, and gathered Tommy with one fierce arm, while blessing Eleanor and scolding her in the same breath. You foolish, brave creature. If his mother had lost him, she'd never have let me hear the end of it. That absurdly broke the tension. Fiona laughed and then nearly cried. Jamie let out a breath and sat down on the grass as if his knees had given way. Even Alistair's mouth moved, though he was still looking at Eleanor as if he had discovered some truth too late to deserve it. Mrs. Kerr, steering Tommy homeward, called over her shoulder, And if any of you great people mean to leave those cursed steps unfenced another week, I shall have words for the lot. Yes, Mrs. Kerr, said Alistair obediently, never taking his eyes from Eleanor. Fiona sprang up and seized Eleanor's arm. You are bleeding. We must go in at once. It is a scratch. It is a heroic scratch, Fiona declared, which is much worse. As they turned back toward the house, Alistair fell into step beside Eleanor. For several paces he said nothing. Then quietly enough that only she could hear, he said, I had forgotten what courage looked like when it was not wearing my name. She should have answered with something sharp. Instead, because the sea was bright, The child was safe, and his voice held neither pride nor command, only humbled wonder. She felt the first dangerous loosening in herself. And when she glanced up, she saw that he was not merely grateful. He was looking at her as a man looks when admiration has become personal. That evening the house settled early. The neighbors who had stayed on after the storm had dined and withdrawn to cards. Lady Beatrice had pleaded fatigue, and in truth had taken to her room with a tray, a bottle of ratafia, and every intention of issuing judgments upon the world from bed. Fiona had been claimed by her mother for some duty involving notes and seating. Even the Earl had retired before 10. Eleanor, who had discovered that admiration was nearly as unsettling as insult when it came from the wrong man, found herself too wakeful for her chamber. She went instead in search of the book she had left in the morning room, and not finding it there, followed the likely trail of it to the library. The library at Lennox House was long, oak-paneled, and always warmer than one expected. Lamps glowed on two side tables. The fire had burned low but not out. Rain had begun again, not violent now, only a soft tapping against the windows. The room looked empty. She had just reached the shelf where Fiona often misplaced novels among sermons, when voices came from the smaller inner room beyond the folding doors. Men's voices. One taught, the other strained. Eleanor ought to have withdrawn at once, she knew that. But her own name, spoken low and distinct, stopped her with her hand on the spine of a book. "It should have been told long ago," said Alistair. Jamie answered, "And made what better? You had already spoken. The whole thing was done." "By me," Alistair said, with a force that struck through the door. "Do not try to spare me now. You never spared her." There was a silence. Eleanor stood very still in the dim library, every sense sharpened. Jamie said at last, "I was 22 and an idiot." "You were a coward." "Yes." The word came out almost angrily, as if he hated the ease of admitting what had become undeniable. "Yes, I was. If you wish it, I shall say so in every room in Scotland. Do not theatricalize what you would not endure honestly at the time." The rebuke landed. When Jamie spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "I liked that she admired nothing in me. Do you know, that was the first thing. Every other girl in Bath laughed when I expected it, and fluttered when I bowed. Miss Vale looked at me as if she saw directly through all the nonsense. It made me vain enough to think I must alter her opinion." Eleanor closed her eyes for one instant. Foolish, beautiful boy. She had seen more clearly than he knew, and not clearly enough. So I followed her, teased her, stood too near, talked as though I had rights where I had none. In the conservatory, I had no intention of offering for her. I only meant— He broke off with disgust. "God forgive me. I only meant to hear her answer as if I was serious enough to deserve one. And when I came in," said Alistair, "I saw at once what you believed. I could have said it was my fault. I could have said she had told me to leave her alone." Jamie's voice thinned. "But Lady Wexford was there, and Charrington, and half the room. They were all looking. I thought, if I laughed and let you think me trapped for a moment, it would all pass as a jest among men." Eleanor's grip tightened on the book until the leather creaked. Alistair spoke with terrible quiet. "Among men. I did not know you would say what you said. You knew me well enough to fear embarrassment more than injustice." There was another silence, longer this time. Rain threaded softly at the glass. Then Jamie said, not excusing himself now, only wrecked by it, "I knew if I contradicted you, I should have to marry her or stand exposed as a brute. And I was not in love with her, so I let her bear it." Eleanor's face burned, though no one could see her. There it was, not merely youthful carelessness, not merely misunderstanding. Choice. Comfort weighed against her life, and her life found lighter. Inside the room, a chair scraped. "I have despised that memory for years," Alistair said. "Yet I let myself think the full shame was mine alone, because even that spared me from naming you properly." Jamie gave a broken laugh. "No, you enjoyed being the righteous brother too much." "Yes." The blunt agreement struck almost harder than any denial. No gentling of it, no polished family falsehood. Jamie said, after a moment, "What will you do? I do not know yet. Alistair's voice had changed. Less anger now, more fatigue. But if Miss Vale remains under this roof another day, she shall not do so while we sit with the truth and expect her to bear our comfort. Eleanor heard the step then, one of them moving toward the outer room. She had no time to retreat far enough to conceal that she had listened. She set the book back upon the shelf with more steadiness than she felt. The folding door opened. Jamie came out first and stopped dead when he saw her. Whatever color had returned to his face over the past days vanished at once. Behind him, Alistair appeared, and the instant his eyes found hers, he knew. No one spoke. The library, warm a moment before, seemed suddenly airless. Jamie's mouth opened and shut again. He looked not young now, nor charming, nor even particularly handsome. He looked merely human and frightened. "Miss Vale," he said hoarsely. Eleanor regarded him. She had imagined this man in memory 100 times, resented, dismissed, occasionally pitied. None of those imaginings had prepared her for the plainness of seeing remorse in him and finding it useless. "You may spare yourself the trouble of explanation," she said. Jamie flinched as if struck. Alistair took one step forward. "Eleanor." She turned on him before he could come nearer. "Do not." Her voice was low, but both men went still. "You speak of truth in private very earnestly. It is almost impressive." He took the blow without protest. Eleanor folded her hands because they had begun to tremble. "What comforts me most, Lord Strathleven, is to learn not that you once judged me unjustly. I had some knowledge of that already, but that your family has had the pieces of the truth among you for years." Jamie's face twisted. "No one knew it all." "No," she said. "Then perhaps I should be grateful the fragments were so carefully distributed." "Eleanor," Alistair said again, and there was real pain in it now. "I did not know what he would say tonight. But you knew enough to ask me for patience while you decided how brave to be. That landed." She saw it. Neither brother tried to answer. At length, Eleanor inclined her head with the same awful composure she had worn at dinner. "The roads are passable now. Lady Beatrice and I shall leave in the morning." She moved to pass them. Jamie stepped back at once. Alistair did not attempt to stop her, though every line of him seemed drawn toward doing so. When she reached the door, he said quietly, "If you go tomorrow without hearing me." She looked over her shoulder. "I have heard enough for one house," she said. Then she left them in the lamplit library with the rain whispering at the windows and one hard new fact standing between them all. She meant to go, and this time no one could pretend not to know why. By the following evening, Lennox House was bright again. The roads had cleared enough that departures might have begun. Yet Mrs. Lennox, who considered retreat after difficulty a kind of vulgar surrender, insisted on keeping the musicale long promised to their neighbors. Carriages arrived in the dusk. Lamps flared in the hall. Servants moved with practiced speed through rooms scented with beeswax, flowers, and fresh coal fires. In the drawing room, the pianoforte stood open, chairs arranged in graceful rows that suggested informality, while allowing everyone an excellent view of everyone else. Eleanor had meant to leave that morning. Lady Beatrice, whose gout had developed a sudden and suspicious twinge at the very word departure, had declared herself incapable of travel before the next day. Eleanor had not believed one syllable of it, but she had been trapped all the same. Lady Beatrice had then looked at her over the rim of a teacup and said, "If men are preparing to make spectacles of themselves, my dear, the least we can do is sit where we may observe properly." So Eleanor stood now near the far end of the drawing room, in silver-grey silk borrowed from Lady Beatrice's stores, her gloved hands folded, every nerve alive beneath her composure. Fiona hovered near her with the look of a loyal spaniel trying very hard to seem like a lady. Mrs. Lennox moved through the guests with polished authority. The Earl pretended indifference from his large chair and missed nothing. Lady Margaret had come, beautiful and grave in dark blue, her face unreadable. Alistair had not yet spoken to Eleanor alone since the library. He had bowed to her at dinner. He had placed Lady Beatrice with exact courtesy. He had conducted himself like a man walking towards something from which there would be no return. The first songs began. A neighboring girl sang an Italian air with more confidence than tune. An older gentleman played the violin creditably. There was movement, murmured appreciation. a flutter of fans. For 10 minutes, the room almost succeeded in being what it pretended to be. Then Mrs. Charrington arrived late enough to be noticed. She entered in mauve silk and apology, all brightness and excuses, about a wheel mired near the birch copse, and was received because receiving people was what houses like this did. Yet Eleanor saw at once, in the widow's quick assessing glance, that the delay had sharpened rather than softened her appetite. When the interval for tea came and small tables were drawn near the walls, Mrs. Charrington found herself within easy speaking distance of the Lennox family circle. That was no accident. With her cup in hand and 2 listeners already leaning toward her, she said in a voice just warm enough to travel, "I protest that no London season ever offered a more dramatic household than this one. Storm, rescue, mystery guest. One might begin to expect the novel." Fiona stiffened. Lady Beatrice raised her quizzing glass and peered over it with pleasurable menace. Alistair, across the room speaking to a county magistrate, turned his head almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Lennox said, 'Our house has no taste for theatrics, Mrs. Charrington.' "But only for heroism, then." The widow smiled at Eleanor. "Lord Strathleven has become the very talk of the county, to save a lady from drowning and restore her to society in the same week. How wonderfully restorative the northern air must be." The 2 women beside her tittered and then stilled when no one else joined them. Eleanor set down her untouched tea. "If society requires restoring, ma'am, I fear one storm will not suffice." A gleam came into Mrs. Charrington's eyes. "Dear Miss Vale, you always did answer prettily. I remember saying so in Bath, though circumstances were perhaps less favorable there." The room altered, not loudly. Rooms like this rarely did anything loudly. A thread of silence ran outward from that little group. People did not turn all at once, but attention bent. Fiona took one impulsive step forward. Lady Beatrice laid a hand on her wrist and held her still. Mrs. Charrington went on with that same dangerous ease. "We have all been young, have we not? And a misunderstanding with a gentleman need not ruin a woman forever, if her friends are determined to forget it." Eleanor felt the old heat rise in her face, then settle into something colder. She opened her mouth. Alistair's voice reached them first. "No, Mrs. Charrington," he said. "It need not have ruined her at all." He had crossed the room so quietly that no one had seemed to notice until he was there. Now every person in hearing distance noticed. He stood between the tea table and the fire, one hand empty at his side, no smile left in him. Mrs. Charrington blinked. "My lord." Alistair did not look at her. He looked at Eleanor once, briefly, as though asking leave for what should never have required it, then faced the room. "What was said in Bath," he said, each word clear as glass, "was said by me. The misunderstanding was mine. Miss Vale gave my brother no encouragement, sought no advantage, and behaved with more propriety than either he or I deserved. I accused her publicly of conduct she had not shown. I was wrong. She has borne the consequence of my arrogance for years, while I bore none. I did not choose to remember." A cup rattled against a saucer somewhere near the door. Jamie, standing by the pianoforte, had gone as white as paper. Mrs. Lennox made a soft sound, almost not a sound at all. The Earl sat forward. Lady Margaret's fan closed in her hand. Alistair went on, and now he did look at his brother. James Lennox behaved shamefully in pursuing a lady who had asked to be left in peace, then letting her stand under censure he knew she did not deserve. If blame is required, let it rest where it ought, on the men who preferred their comfort to her good name. No one moved. Mrs. T. Charrington, who had spent a lifetime navigating currents of politeness, was for once left without a graceful stroke. "Lord Strathleven, I had no wish. To amuse yourself at Miss Vale's expense?" His voice remained perfectly level. "No. I think perhaps that was exactly your wish." Colour rose violently under her powder. Eleanor stood very still. The moment she had once imagined in bitterness and dismissed as impossible was taking place before her eyes, and it did not feel triumphant so much as astonishing. He had done it. Not artfully, not halfway. He had torn open his own ease and his brother's, his family's comfort, his expected future with Lady Margaret, and laid the truth in the center of the room, where everyone must step around it. Lady Beatrice broke the silence first. "How refreshing," she said, loud enough for half the room. "A gentleman with a memory and a spine." The Earl gave a short bark that might have been a laugh or fury. Fiona began to cry and tried very hard not to. Mrs. Lennox's mouth tightened, but she could not deny what had been spoken before so many witnesses. Lady Margaret looked from Alistair to Eleanor and then away, her face proud and pale. Mrs. Charrington set down her cup with a hand that trembled. "I see. I have been unfortunate." "Yes," said Alistair. "At last." No one rescued her. The room remained unsettled even when conversation tried to begin again. It could not be smoothed. Something irreversible had occurred. Eleanor's name had been spoken cleanly, where once it had been stained. Alistair had chosen his side before everyone who mattered. And yet, as his gaze returned to her across the silence, she understood another truth just as clearly. Public justice could not by itself make a heart trust the hand that offered it. The house did not sleep easily after the musicale. Doors closed softly in distant corridors. Carriages had long since rolled away. Servants moved with muted feet over carpets that had heard too much. Somewhere in the West Wing, a clock struck 2, then 3. Eleanor lay awake through all of it, one hand under her cheek, watching the fire sink and trying not to feel the force of a room full of faces turning as Alistair spoke. By dawn, she had given up on sleep. The sea was calm for the first time since her arrival. A thin white mist lay over the lower ground, and the air held that early chill which clears the mind and stings the lungs at once. Eleanor wrapped a dark cloak over her morning gown and slipped from the side door before the house had fully roused. She had not planned her steps. They led of themselves toward the shore. The path down the headland was damp with night dew. Gulls wheeled high and silent in the paling sky. Below, the tide breathed over the stones with a gentleness that seemed almost mocking. It was here, near this curve of beach, beneath that black shoulder of rock, that she had gone under and come back into the world in his arms. No place in Scotland was less suited to calm thought. And yet she had come. She stood a little above the shingle, one hand against the rough post of the fence, and looked out across the water until she heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn. "I thought I might find you here," Alistair said. His voice was quiet enough not to startle. He had either guessed her restlessness or not slept himself. She suspected both. "Then your powers of inference improve," she said. He came no nearer than propriety allowed, though there was no one to witness it but the sea. "If you wish me gone, I will leave. You say that more readily now." "I have been taught." A faint, unwilling smile threatened and disappeared. Eleanor tightened her hand on the post. For a moment, neither spoke. Morning light spread slowly across the water. The wind touched a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. Before she could lift a hand to smooth it back, Alistair half moved, then stopped himself so abruptly it hurt to watch. "At least," she said, "you are learning not to take liberties." His gaze dropped. "I have taken all the wrong ones." That simplicity was dangerous. It made mockery harder. He said after a pause, "I do not know whether what I did last night has given you any peace. I know only that it was years too late." "It was necessary," Eleanor said, "and public. For that I thank you." He looked at her then, and in his expression she saw both gratitude for the small concession and the knowledge that she had given him very little. "I would do more if I could." "Yes," she said softly. "That is what alarms me." He did not pretend not to understand. "Because you think I act from guilt. Do you not?" He drew breath, and she saw him choose honesty over the smoother path. "At first, yes. When I found you in the sea, I think guilt struck me before anything else had time. I knew your face, and all at once I was holding the living cost of my own vanity." His mouth tightened. "Then there were these days in the house, hearing you, watching you with Fiona, seeing you descend those damned steps for Tommy when any sensible person would have frozen where she stood. It is no longer guilt alone." "No longer," Eleanor repeated. "I admire you." The words came low but steady. "I think of you when I leave a room and look for you when I enter one. I know the sound of your tread in the passage. I know when you are tired, though you will not admit it. Last night, when Charrington spoke again, I would have stopped her if every guest in the county had walked out after. Not because I owed it only, because I could not bear to let anyone touch you with that lie again. Her heart gave one hard, betraying beat. This, then, was what made such men dangerous when they were earnest. He took one step closer, still not close enough to touch. Eleanor, marry me. There it was, plain, direct, and exactly what she had feared. The sea went on breathing at their feet. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them on the quiet water. You choose your moments with appalling confidence, my lord. If confidence remained to me, I should mistrust it. Then do not call me Eleanor and ask for my life in the same breath, as if one brave evening settled all. She turned to face him fully now. His expression had changed, not offended, only intent, wounded already, because he knew this would not be easy. You have given me back something of my name. I know what that cost you, but marriage is not the natural receipt issued to a gentleman when he has wronged a woman and finally says so before company. No. His voice deepened. It is what I want. Is it? She hated the tremor in her own. Or do you want never again to remember Bath without a wife beside you to prove you corrected yourself in the end? He flinched, not dramatically. The truth simply struck home. She went on before pity could soften her. You speak of admiration. I am glad of it. I would not be your burden. But I have lived too long under other people's interpretations of me to walk into a marriage where I might forever wonder whether I was chosen from love or honor. Both may exist together. Yes, but I should know which would remain if the debt were gone. He stared at her as if willing her to believe what he himself had only lately learned to name. Eleanor, I love you. The words did not come polished. They came almost harshly, as if dragged up from a place in him that had never meant to speak first. She felt the ache of them, and because she did, she shook her head. You may, she said. I begin to think perhaps you do. But if I accept you now, after last night, after your public confession, after everything, I shall always hear the world praising your honor, and never know whether you once desired me enough to come after me with nothing to repair. He looked as though she had opened him with a knife, and he could not even protest the justice of it. The mist was lifting. Soon the house would be waking in earnest. They could not stand there much longer. Eleanor gathered her cloak more closely. Do not ask me again today. She moved to pass him. This time, he did not block the path, did not plead, did not use tenderness as pressure. He stepped aside. Only when she had gone several paces did he speak. What shall I do, then? She stopped without turning. Let me leave, she said. And then, if what you feel survives the absence of obligation, you may decide whether to follow it. When she walked on, he let her go. That was the change. Not the proposal, though it would have altered many things. Not even her refusal, though it had cut them both. It was that he had heard the hardest answer she could give and chosen at last, not to bend her with his will. By 11 the next morning, trunks were strapped, shawls folded, bandboxes tied, and the front hall of Lennox House had taken on the controlled disorder of departure. Lady Beatrice sat near the fire, as if conducting a military withdrawal, her maid hovering behind her, with smelling salts no one believed she required. Mrs. Kerr oversaw the hampers, with severity enough for an army. Fiona drifted from one task to another, in visible misery, touching ribbons that did not need touching, and asking every third minute whether the carriage rug was warm enough. Jamie had not shown himself. Mrs. Lennox had sent down a civil message, regretting that a headache prevented her appearance, which everyone correctly understood as pride in a lace cap. Eleanor stood by the long table in her traveling dress and gloves, outwardly calm. Her valise lay ready, her bonnet strings tied. The house in which she had nearly drowned, nearly forgiven, and nearly lost herself, looked strangely ordinary by daylight. Lady Beatrice watched her over steepled fingers. If you continue to look so composed, my dear, people will begin to suspect you have character. I have always feared as much. That was almost cheerful. Very good. We may get you safely out of Scotland yet." Fiona turned and flung her arms round Eleanor. "You must write to me," she said fiercely. "And if you do not, I shall write to you until you are worn down by sheer quantity." Eleanor laughed despite the ache in her throat and kissed her cheek. "Then I had better save us both trouble and begin at once." Fiona drew back, blinking suspiciously bright eyes. "If my brother has any sense, he—" "Hush," said Lady Beatrice. "Either he has found some, or he has not. We shall know soon enough." At that moment the library door opened. Alistair came out first. He was not in riding clothes, nor in the easy morning coat of a man seeing guests off. He wore dark blue, plain and formal enough to show that what he was about to do was no hurried impulse. Behind him came the Earl, with his stick and formidable brows, Lady Margaret Tresham, pale but steady, and, to Eleanor's surprise, Mrs. Lennox herself, looking as though she had decided headache must yield to history. Jamie followed last, grave and stripped of carelessness. Conversation in the hall dropped away. Even the footman stood straighter. Alistair crossed to Lady Beatrice first and bowed. "My lady, I ask your pardon for addressing your companion before I have spoken to you, but I hope you know I do not forget what protection she has found in your friendship." Lady Beatrice regarded him coolly. "Protection she required because your sex and station are so often ornamental, where women need them practical. But go on, Lord Strathleven. I find myself curious." A flicker of humbled amusement touched his face. Then he turned to Eleanor. He did not take her hand or corner her. He stood before her in the open hall, where every word could be heard, and said, "Miss Vale, before my family and yours by affection, I have something more to speak." The title struck her first. Miss Vale, not Eleanor. Respect before intimacy. Lady Margaret moved then, one step only, her fan closed in her hand. "Before Lord Strathleven proceeds, I should like one word of my own." She looked not at Eleanor but at Alistair. "You owe me honesty no less than you owed it elsewhere. I think I have now received enough of it to release us both." A murmur passed through the hall. Mrs. Lennox closed her eyes for an instant. The Earl muttered something too low to catch. Lady Margaret turned to Eleanor, and for the first time warmth entered her face, though touched with pain. "I do not enjoy being made a spectator to another woman's love story, Miss Vale, but I dislike falsehood more. I wish you joy, if joy is to be had." Eleanor bowed her head. "You are more generous than I deserve." "No," said Lady Margaret, "merely more practical than the gentleman." That won a breath of laughter even from Lady Beatrice. Alistair waited until the moment settled. Then he said, "My father knows that I cannot pursue the alliance long intended with Lady Margaret Tresham. My mother knows it. My brother knows why. I do not ask Miss Vale to cure my guilt or adorn my honor. I ask because when she leaves this house, it seems to me she takes with her every lively, difficult, admirable thing that has made the past week worth enduring, and the future worth wanting." The hall had gone so still that the crackle from the fire sounded loud. He looked only at Eleanor. "I thought once that rank excused certainty. You taught me better. I thought a man could decide what a woman needed and call it kindness. You taught me that honor begins in believing her when belief costs him pride. I cannot offer you a heart untouched by error. I can offer one altered by loving you. If you leave and never wish to see me again, I will deserve it and bear it. But if there is room in you to believe that what I feel is not debt, not pity, not vanity, if there is room to believe that I love your courage, your wit, your mercy, your temper, your stubbornness, the look you have when you are trying not to laugh at me, then stay, stay, and marry me. Not because I saved you from the sea, because I cannot imagine home, or peace, or any honest happiness, now that I have known you and nearly lost you twice." Fiona had put both hands over her mouth. Lady Beatrice was openly crying. Mrs. Kerr, passing through with a cloak over one arm, paused in the doorway and remained there like a carved saint of domestic judgment. Eleanor looked at Alistair and saw hope, and the humility to survive if hope failed. He had come after her with nothing left to mend except the distance between them. Her gloves trembled in her hands. She pulled them off because she could not answer him through kid leather and composure. "Lord Strathleven," she said, and her voice shook enough to make Fiona cry outright. You are very fortunate that I love your faults almost as much as your virtues, since I have had such abundant opportunity to study them. The breath that left him was almost a laugh, almost a prayer. A smile broke across his face. May I take that for encouragement? You may take it, she said, stepping toward him at last. For yes. There was no elegance after that. Fiona flew at them both. The Earl barked, "Well, thank God!" as if someone had finally ended a long sermon. Miss Lennox, after one proud, resisting moment, came forward and held out her hand to Eleanor with dignity. That was not quite softness, and not far from it. "If my son has the sense to value you properly," she said, "I shall try not to hold his delay against him all his life." Eleanor took the offered hand. "That is more mercy than he showed me in Bath, madam." To her credit, Mrs. Lennox accepted the rebuke. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is." Jamie approached next, not smiling, not expecting ease. "Miss Vale." Eleanor looked at him. Whatever he read in her face, he bowed his head. "I will spend a long time being ashamed," he said. "It will not be long enough. But I am glad you will not leave us with this unfinished." She could not forgive him all at once, but she was tired of carrying every wound alone. "Then begin by behaving better to the next woman who asks for peace," she said. "I will." At last, Alistair stood beside her again, close enough that the warmth of him reached her sleeve. His hand opened, asking. She laid her fingers in it, and the simple rightness of that touch undid something guarded in her. Lady Beatrice dabbed her eyes and announced, "Since no one is leaving, I shall require luncheon." Laughter broke through the hall, easy at last. Later, when astonishment had softened into congratulations, and the servants had somehow learned everything without being told, Alistair drew Eleanor for one brief moment to the west door, where the winter sun lay pale across the headland and the sea beyond shone calm as hammered silver. "That shore," he said, looking toward the rocks below, "is the ugliest and kindest place I have ever known." Eleanor smiled up at him. "It nearly killed me, and gave me no peace until you said yes." "Then we may call it even." He bent and kissed her hand first, with all the reverence he had once lacked. When he lifted his head, there was wonder still in his face. "You know, Ho," he said softly, "I should save you from drowning 1,000 times if only this once ends the same way." She laughed then, bright as the water below. "One rescue is quite enough, my lord. The rest of your life may be spent proving you deserved the first." "With pleasure," he said, and because he had earned plainness from her at last, she let him kiss her, not under compulsion or in debt, but as the man who had finally learned to love her where everyone could see.